Are Trump supporters actually conservative? Should these terms liberal and conservative just be done away with altogether? What do they even mean anymore? I mean, with the way that the modern Trump movement works, the MAGA movement, and the Republican Party that it's part of, what are we even talking about? What is a conservative? Are Trump supporters conservative? That's the question of this video. Well, I just don't know. I might still use the term conservative and liberal, but more and more frequently, I see myself using the terms left and right. They don't evoke any sort of, emotions or anything. It's like, oh, left and right. You like the direction, you move left, you move right. Conservatives, what do you think of when you hear the term conservative? You think of someone who wants to conserve things. It might be our environment, it might be our constitution, it might be our democratic republic, our infrastructure, simple things like that. Our welfare state, which obviously has not existed throughout all of our country's history, but they want to conserve some of that because it's existed for some of it over 90 years, some of it over 60 years. But yeah, that's what you might think of when you think conservative. But really what we're seeing with the Trump supporters is not so much that they want to conserve anything in particular. What do they actually want to conserve? The white majority within the country? That's possible. But it seems like their conservative principles, to the extent that they exist, are more focused on a sort of very intangible cultural thing, that, oh, we want to conserve the good culture of America and the good people. And you know what, those types of words, they tend to lend themselves to accusations of racism, the way that they spew things. And I'm not saying all Trump supporters are racist, but I am saying that the way they sort of phrase things, it's ambiguous. It's very hard to define. It's vague. See my video on why are Trump supporters so vague. They are very vague with how they say they want to conserve things. Meanwhile, they're not so vague when they talk about things that they want to change. That's kind of interesting. They talk about wanting to abolish all of these government agencies, abolish all of these institutions. The WHO, the EPA. Oh yeah, just get rid of that. Get rid of all this stuff. What is that? What is that conserving? That's just getting rid of things. That's just upending our way of life. Now, obviously, the Department of Education, the EPA, they've not existed throughout all of our nation's history, but they've certainly existed for a good chunk of time, including under Republican presidents like Reagan and both of the Bushes, So why all of a sudden do they no longer want to conserve these things? Why do they want to upend these things that do stuff to actually conserve good things within our country? Like access to education, civil rights, access for underrepresented populations. That's what the Department of Education does. The EPA, of course, conserves our environment, or at least is involved in it, not single-handedly, but they're designed to do that. They're designed to produce regulations that conserve the environment. The Constitution. Do Trump supporters really believe in conserving the Constitution? To the extent that they do, it's only incidental. It's only when they want to conserve it in defense of President Trump, Oh, we got to conserve Trump's constitutional rights. His right to due process really matters. His Sixth Amendment right, that really matters. Now, his right to everything else matters, but your right to all this other stuff, I mean, it depends on whether or not we like you. So it's not so much about conservation or conserving anything with with Trump supporters. With conservatives, it actually is. But these people are very selective. And I'm not saying, oh, conservatives are great and Trump supporters are terrible. But Trump supporters are sort of a bastardization of conservatives, where you have people who seem sort of conservative, but they latch onto Trump because they kind of like that Trump's conservative, but they also kind of like something else. They like that he pisses off the left, and they think that pissing off the left is a conservative virtue in and of itself. I will tell you this, it's not. There are plenty of people, on the other side, on the left, who will criticize Republicans. But the fact that they criticize Republicans does not necessarily make themselves leftists. There are plenty of independents and centrists who are very aggressive against Republicans. That doesn't mean that they are leftists. Similarly, there are people who say all the worst things imaginable about leftists, but that does not mean that they are conservative. Trump talks about, wanting to deport Marxists. He talks about wanting to deport these crazy pro-Palestine protesters. He calls his political opponents vermin. Now, that does not necessarily mean that he is conservative, though. And that does not mean that if you vote for Trump and you agree with him saying that you are conservative. And in fact, if you support some of these attacks on our system that will allow Trump to take punitive action against groups that he disfavors, i.e. his political opponents, who he disparages and calls vermin, then you're not really conservative. I mean, you're trying to change things. You're not progressive. You're not leftist, of course. But You're not trying to conserve the constitutional protections, the system that we have in place for ensuring that no person, conservative, progressive, centrist, libertarian, green, communist, whatever, can just abuse the system and bully their political opponents. But Trump supporters are like, well, no, Donald Trump needs to get revenge. He was unfairly targeted throughout the 2024 campaign. They tried to assassinate him, even though they did not. It was a lone wolf 20-year-old with a bunch of mental problems. There was no establishment backing of this guy. The Democrats were not involved. They say they tried to lock him up, and it's like, no, it wasn't. No, he committed crimes, and he was found guilty by a jury. There was no they involved in this. So they're like, oh, yeah, Trump's got to get revenge. It's his right. So we need to allow him to. We need to allow him to weaponize the Justice Department against his political opponents, and we need to weaken their constitutional protections. Free speech does not apply to these people. It only applies to my side. So they do not want to conserve all that much when it comes to constitutional protections. With respect to economics, maybe that's the only area in which Trump supporters are conservative, but they don't really argue for conservative solutions on economics in any sort of way that's intelligible or any way that's, similar to how conservatives of the past would make those arguments. If you listen to Ben Shapiro talk about economics, he'll criticize tariffs, which is also something that conservatives have historically opposed. He'll criticize tariffs, pointing out that they're a tax, which they are. Pete Buttigieg pointed that out on X too. He says they're a tax. They're a tax. That's bad. That's government involvement in the economy, and that sucks. That is against conservative principles in his view. And yeah, he is generally just against a lot of government involvement when it comes to the economy. He's a conservative. He will make his arguments in favor of those types of solutions, or against those types of solutions, I should say, government solutions. And he does so. He might bring up some studies. He might make logical arguments at times. I think that they can be picked apart, and that some of it is motivated by just a desire to protect the bottom line of the uber wealthy, because we do know that the Daily Wire is funded by billionaires. But he says stuff that's not rooted in just being a sycophant toward Donald Trump. It's like, hey, ideology. This is my ideology. My conservative ideology tells me that the market will provide the solution, not the federal government here. So that is what conservative argumentation on the economy looks like. But Trump supporters on the economy, Trump supporters on government involvement in the economy, what do they say? They say, oh, government's going to destroy, government's going to ruin all this stuff. Yeah, government's bad. Everything the government touches turns to crap. Yeah, get rid of the government. Oh, the economy, limited government, whatever, deregulate everything. They don't really make any argument for how that's going to help the country. They just make an argument based on, oh, government bad, and Trump is going to make the economy good. And prices were high under Biden, so Biden must have been doing something wrong. But as I pointed out before, they're very vague in their argumentation. They're vague. They will not point to any policies enacted by Joe Biden during his presidency that caused prices to go up. They just won't. They just won't. They'll just say, well, Trump's going to make things better, on the economy. And better usually means deregulation. They have to grapple with this new bill that was passed recently by the House, and how it's just total deregulatory madness, and it's going to add to the debt and the deficit. It's massive tax cuts for the wealthy. Why is the government getting involved in giving the wealthy more money? Why is that? Why do we need the government to give the wealthy all these subsidies? That's another question. They don't really address that as much. And it seems like, they don't care about that. Being a Trump supporter often tends to mean ignoring certain inconvenient facts. We all ignore inconvenient facts, progressives, conservatives alike. But Trump supporters seem to rely on it very, very heavily for making their cases. Ignoring any possibility that Trump committed crimes. And also, we have to talk about the issue of crime. We have to. A lot of people pointed out the awkwardness of this presidential election recently, where you had the first convicted felon president against a prosecutor president, a presidential candidate who was running, on a less aggressively progressive platform when it comes to crime. She was a prosecutor in the state of California. She did lock people up for weed violations, and that's something that really did not make a lot of progressives happy. In fact, Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman of Texas, recently said that this probably hurt Kamala in the election. But you have all these Trumpers who are so obsessed with law and order, who are like, oh, law and order, law and order. By the way, back the convicted felon. And they were putting up signs and bumper stickers and stuff during that election saying, I'm standing with the convicted felon. I'm standing with the convicted felon. Where are these tough on crime principles? A true conservative would say, look, I don't agree with some of these Democratic Party ideas about, restorative justice and rehabilitation. I think we need to have punitive aspects to our justice system. But also, I don't believe in celebrating convicted criminals. Donald Trump is not a great guy. He's not a great guy. He committed crimes. A jury found that. It wasn't biased. It was just the way that the system evaluated things. We need to respect the system, and we need to respect the jury's verdict. But these Trump supporters don't take the conservative approach to it. They take the pro-Trump approach to it, which is not conservative. It's, when he does it, it's good. When he commits crimes, it's great. And in fact, he's not even a criminal. He should be above the law, and that's why they applauded the Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus the United States from back in July, where it's like, he gets criminal immunity for any acts which can be argued to be official, That was a pretty interesting interpretation, by the way. And yes, I know some actual conservatives agreed with that too, but they didn't so much agree with the idea that, it's cool to be a convicted felon like Trump is. They're a little more, they approach Trump with a little more hesitancy because they're like, okay, this guy, we can't just bend all of our principles to suit him, We can't just say, crime is cool when he does it. That's kind of ridiculous. And we see that from some of the Ben Shapiros of the world. There are plenty of other conservatives, I think, who are starting to get anxious about the Trump administration. I will say that they kind of wish that, the Republican Party had just nominated someone like Ron DeSantis in 2024. Ron DeSantis is more conservative than Trump. He just is. And, ironically, he's less authoritarian than Trump. He's not a guy who talks about wanting to get rid of the Constitution, even if some of his actions have been unconstitutional as governor. But he doesn't talk about using the system for revenge. And that's what a lot of Trump supporters are like, the revenge aspect, this calls for abandoning all conservative principles, all constitutional principles. It's about getting revenge on the leftists and the people who tried to ruin this country. So what exactly do they want to conserve? They don't want to conserve the criminal justice system because the criminal justice system punished their boy Donald Trump. They don't want to conserve the Constitution because they think that their political opponents need their constitutional rights suspended. They don't even understand the Constitution. You heard Kristi Noem the other day fail to define habeas corpus. She said that it's the right of the president to remove people from the country. That's not what it is. That is not anywhere in the Constitution, Miss Noem. Seriously? They might believe in conserving small government with respect to the economy, but it's not so much that they're conserving that. It's that they're saying, no, we want to abolish any government involvement in the economy. We want to abolish that stuff that's existed for a long time. Yeah, no, EPA regulations that make sure that we have clean drinking water and clean air, that should not be conserved. We should not conserve our clean environment, our safe environment, our good places, our good times, our good land. No, conserve none of that. Just government bad, we can get rid of some of that. We should go back to the days of no income tax, maybe. No income tax. We've had the income tax for over 100 years. It's whatever. You pay tax on your income. That's what it is. We recognize that taxes are something that exist in pretty much every society. Can you name a society which does not have taxes? Now, they say, it's theft. It's like, okay, so if you want to abolish taxes, which some Trump supporters are saying that, then you don't support conserving this part of society. Libertarians will say, we believe taxation is theft. We don't want that. And they don't call themselves conservatives, and they don't call that a conservative principle. So they're more straightforward and honest. But Trump supporters, how can we call them conservative when they want to conserve so little of our society, so little of our governmental institutions, our policy? It's just wanting to conserve some vague notion of what it is to be an American. And when they start to try to define that, it gets really concerning. It gets really concerning because you wonder, what actually do they want to conserve? Why do their conservative principles always relate to the border? And I would argue that not all of their border principles are conservative themselves, because they support sending people to El Salvadorian labor camps with absolutely brutal conditions and just violating due process as well. So that's not conservative. They're not conserving due process. They're saying, we get to selectively apply due process. President Trump and his administration do not need to give people their right to due process. Well, you're not really conserving constitutional protections for people in this country then, are you? And yes, people who are in this country, even if they're not citizens, do get constitutional protections. Let's be clear about that. But they're like, we don't want to conserve that. No, that's dumb. We want to protect the border. The Supreme Court can suck it. They're wrong even when they rule against the president 9-0. They don't want to conserve that principle of saying, the Supreme Court The Supreme Court, we gotta follow by them. They interpret the Constitution, and we have to abide by the Constitution. So when the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution a certain way, we should play that game. We should go along with them. Trump is like, no, the Supreme Court's wrong. J.D. Vance is out there scolding John Roberts, saying it was profoundly wrong of him to say that it's his job to check the executive branch. And yes, I know that Biden, of course, Biden took actions against the Supreme Court in terms of, going out there and saying, no, I really want to cancel student loan debt. But Biden doesn't call himself a conservative. That's the thing. He thought that there were other ways to do it under legislation. But Trump out here is like, yeah, no, constitutional rights of American citizens, that's BS. That's BS. I want to deport people. Matt Walsh is saying he should ignore the Supreme Court. And he's like, yeah, deporting illegal aliens is the most important thing ever in this country. So we have to abide by it. We have to just deport them no matter what rights we think they have, no matter what the Constitution says. Nothing trumps the priority of getting rid of these illegal aliens who I say are all MS-13 gang members with no evidence. It really makes you wonder. The conservative principles are taking a backseat to hatred towards others and worship of one man. Then we have to talk, we don't want to talk about this, but we got, the evangelical issue. Evangelical conservatives backed George W. Bush. George W. Bush didn't have an affair in office. Fair enough, whatever. They want a guy who purports to act godly. He's got this country vibe to him. But then they back Trump. Trump is a New York guy who's historically been a Democrat. He's apparently been in softcore porn as well. Did you know that? It's a little known fact about him. He is married to Melania Trump, who herself has posed naked before. Donald Trump, of course, talked about grabbing women by their genitals in 2005. He was caught on camera saying that. Very un-Christ-like thing to do. I simply do not know a Bible verse about grabbing women by their genitals without their consent and not even waiting. But the evangelicals might have conjured something up, conjured some sort of memory or a Bible verse about that up in order to excuse President Trump. Trump is also, of course, committed adultery. Does a woman named Stormy Daniels ring a bell? I feel like I haven't heard about her in a while. She wrote something about Trump's mushroom. But yeah, back in 2018, we remember that whole kerfuffle, the hush money, all that stuff that was going on. Trump paid her hush money. He cheated on his wife while she was pregnant with Barron Trump. His now 18, 19-year-old son, he cheated on his wife when she was pregnant with him. Who should you be more loyal to than your wife? Shouldn't conservatives believe in loyalty to your wife? They're able to excuse all of that. But they will excoriate former President Bill Clinton for Lewinsky Gate. They'll say, oh yeah, he's a creep, he's a rapist, yeah, he's a pedophile. They will ignore all of this stuff when it comes to Trump. They will ignore that Trump was best friends with Jeffrey Epstein. They will ignore those pictures and videos of them together. Look them up, those pictures. Trump looked very young and vibrant back then. He's like chilling with Jeff Epstein, like, yeah, probably checking out some underage women. How on earth is that conservative? Shouldn't you believe in respecting women if you're a conservative? Or at least I should say respecting your wife. He was married at the time. And he's buddies with Jeff Epstein. He's cheating on his wife with a porn star. Conservative principles have been absolutely eroded within the Republican Party, thanks to one man, Donald Trump. He says, oh yeah, these are all BS. They are gone now. And they say, yes, sir. And he says, well, you can still criticize Democrats for it. He brought Bill Clinton's accusers to a 2016 debate against Hillary Clinton after the Access Hollywood tapes were released. And, Bill Clinton was not running for president against Trump, but he was Hillary Clinton's husband. So Trump thought, hey, it was fair game. Apparently, Steve Bannon actually gave him that idea. He brought them in, and it was somewhat of a shrewd political move, but ultimately it was a fallacy, and that fallacy is whataboutism. What about Bill Clinton? He did bad thing to women. You think I'm bad? Well, it was bad of me, but it was worse of Bill Clinton. This is not intended to be a Trump impression. This is intended to be a foolish little boy impression. If you want to hear a good Trump impression, watch Shane Gillis. But yeah, he went up there and did whataboutism in a very childish manner, and he ultimately won the election, and he told the evangelicals, you have to defend me no matter what. They said, yes, sir. And yeah, they're out there excoriating Democrats for any sort of sexual indiscretions that they can find while basically absolving Trump of all of it. Accusations of sexual assault, doesn't matter. It's against Trump, and Trump can do no wrong. Trump can do no wrong in their eyes. So not conservative on sex-related stuff, not conservative on the Constitution, not conservative on crime. Maybe conservative on the economy, but not really capable of making conservative arguments or using conservative reasoning in a way that most actual conservative non-Trump supporters are, which yes, they still do exist. And it's very refreshing when a conservative does not simp for Trump. But yeah, they don't have it in them. They don't have the conservatism in them that Trump supporters don't. And now if I use the word conservative to describe a Trump supporter or a pro-Trump Republican in office, don't excoriate me in the comments. It's just a force of habit, you know. I tend to use the words left and right more often now. I don't necessarily think Trump supporters are inherently right-wing either. I mean, sometimes they're kind of centrist, but they're simping for Trump, and they might actually believe in left-wing stuff, but they abandon that in order to shill for Trump. And maybe when Trump is gone, they'll advocate for more left-wing positions. I don't know. But supporting Trump, generally speaking, is going to be a far-right thing, but not necessarily a conservative thing. It just is. You know, I feel like we've reached a really interesting point in American politics where there's kind of like the far right, there's conservatives, there's the far left, or, you know, I wouldn't say far left, but pretty solid left, and then there's liberals. And the far right is bashing conservatives. They're like, you know, cuck-servatives, they'll use that term. They'll say conservatives don't believe in conserving anything. They haven't conserved anything over the past 60 years or so. And then, you know, the hard left, sometimes socialists, there'll be these people who are, you know, more pro Bernie Sanders. And I'm not saying you have to be a socialist to support Bernie Sanders or anything, but they'll blast liberals and say liberals are foolish, they're morons, they don't understand how things work, they don't understand the problems with capitalism, they're not serious about fixing society's problems, they just don't like Trump and they don't like Republicans, but they don't realize that the Democratic establishment is terrible and incompetent and doesn't care about them. So it's kind of interesting seeing this sort of conflict within different sides with each other. I love seeing civil wars on the Republican side. I don't so much like seeing civil wars on the left-leaning side, although I understand sometimes it's necessary, especially when the former president of the United States, Joe Biden, humiliates the Democratic Party so badly in an attempt to protect his own ego. It's very Trumpian of him, actually. You know, Trump tries to protect his own ego so much, and his supporters do anything to protect him, including abandoning conservative principles. So at the end of the day, I think Trump supporters are more accurately categorized as far right than conservative. I think Democrats are liberal. I think socialists are leftist. I think people, you know, the Republicans of last decade before Trump are the conservatives. But yeah, there's not really much conservatism in Trump supporters. It has yielded to basically simping for Trump. That's a priority, not conservative principles. Any conservative principles that they espouse only tend to be a byproduct of shilling for Trump, unfortunately. Let me know if you agree in the comments below. What do you think? Please like, comment, or subscribe to this channel. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to speaking to you in my next video.